All right, good evening, everyone. Daf Yomi for the week is sponsored by Shmuley and Miriam Fuchs, Le'ilui Nishmas, Shmuley's mother, Beli Yentel Bas Elchanan. And we just would like to wish a mazel tov to the new, I don't know what we say, Saba, right? Aaron
I'm
Kaslasi.
I'm Abba, but it's okay.
You're okay, good. So
Uh,
that's right. Okay, good. And mazel tov and mazal tov, I have to say it right. Mazal
yeah,
tov, and should have many more smachot
thank you.
and much nachat. We are going to be in the Mishnah. That is I mean, if you count the small half Mishnah on the top of the page, it's the third Mishnah down. It's the second one if you don't count that one, the second full Mishnah. So this one is Sholosh Avonim Him. There's three types of rocks, right? And that is Evan Shechatzva Mitchila Lebimus Hareza Asura. If the stone was quarried for the sake of an idolatry, the idolatry they pick happens to be that is the is a bimus is a pedestal, right? It's a pedestal place you put the idol on top of. So if that stone was carved out for that purpose, so then it's for avodah zara. So that is going to be prohibited. If the stone itself was not for idolatry, but they plastered it or they carved into the rock for the sake of idolatry, so then, then all you've got to do is remove the plaster and then you're good to go, right? You remove the Avodah Zarah part of the rock and the original rock remains acceptable. This is parallel to what we talked about in the Mishnah before about houses. If all you did was put an idol on top of the rock, the silk, and then you took it off, Harezu Muteris, that is fine. That's mutter, that they was not a designation of service for Avodah Zara, and that's not going to prohibit the rock. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Ami, V'hu shesayid v'kayid begufa shel evan. This is talking about where you plastered or you carved into the rock itself, right? The hod dumya debayas, because we're trying, but so the rock itself is being plastered or being covered over or being carved into. But the problem with that is that this Mishnah is parallel to the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah told us about three types of houses. This Mishnah is talking about three types of rocks. So this was supposed to be parallel to that previous Mishnah. Tanan, we learned a Mishnah, ubayis lav begufehu. And the house, the plastering over of the house that we talked about wasn't where they scraped into the actual house or plastered into the house. There was merely a covering, and we said just scrape off that covering, any additions based on the Avodah Zarah, and you're fine and you're good to go. So why is it that we're actually carving into this rock or plastering into this rock, and we're still considering that to be a parallel case? Umitzar, so now it's prohibited. So bias nami, ika bene urbe. Then what we should say is that when it comes to the houses, the thing that should be prohibited with a house should be when you plaster between the rocks in the house, like the mortar between the bricks. That's plastering into the house. That would be the parallel. Milo askinan deshie v'hadar shay'e. So are we not talking about a circumstance um, that that he already smoothed that what happened here in the house is they already did plaster the walls. The mortar is already in place. So therefore, any addition that got added on is just to resurface. So therefore, the rock as well that should be talking about here should be a parallel case. You're not actually talking about a carving into the rock. You're talking about just resurfacing the rock. That's whereas if you did some kind of change to the rock itself, maybe the rock itself would be prohibited. Elaki itmar derbi abba derbi ami, sorry, le'inyan bittul itmar. So rather, what's going on here is this statement of Rabbi Ami is talking about nullifying the rock, meaning as follows. The Afagav decided v'kayid begufa shel even. As far as nullifying the idolatry, that's the point of our Mishnah. What do you do in order to get rid of the avodah zarah? All you have to do is remove the plaster that's on this rock. Ki noto mashachidesh shopir dummy. Once you take off whatever was added, then you're back to the beginning. And you don't need a non-Jew to nullify anything, right? Just remove the idolatry from that rock and you're back and you're good. Because what would you have thought otherwise? Since you're actually plastering and you're carving into the rock itself, which is not the same thing as what we were doing in the house, we might think that this is similar to a rock that was quarried out of the mountain for the sake of Avodah Zarah. In that circumstance, the rock itself is prohibited and we can't do anything with it unless we get a non-Jew to come along and nullify the idolatry. But otherwise, we're stuck. So the titzer kula, therefore the whole rock, now that you're carving, we might have thought this is parallel. The guy carved into this rock, so now maybe the whole rock is prohibited, Kamash Mullen. So therefore this mission is making sure it's clear that that's what Ravami's statement is to make it clear that this mission is telling us that despite the fact you're carving into the rock, all you have to do is remove whatever new addition got placed on this rock. The original rock is still the original rock and is not Avodah Zara. If they made adjustments and changes to the rock, then remove those adjustments and changes, and your rock goes back to the way it was, and the Avodah Zara is removed, and you don't need a non-Jew. Okay, that's the end of that Mishnah. Next, we move on. Shalosh Asheros. There are 3 types of Asherah trees, right? These Asherah trees are the trees that were planted and they were worshipped. Elon shenatu mitchilu l'shem avodos kochavim. You could have case number 1, where the tree was planted for the sake of being worshipped. Harezu asura. That tree is prohibited according to everybody. For sure, the tree is prohibited. Gido uploslo l'shem avodos kochavim. So let's say you trimmed it or pruned it for the sake of avodah zara. Vehechlif, and then there's new growth that comes out. No tel mashe hechlif. Then all you have to do in order to remove the avodah zara is remove the new branches, whatever came about after your pruning. Then you remove that, and the tree is fine. Hamid tachta avodos kochamim. If all you did was put avodah zara underneath the tree, v'napla, and you took it away, harezu muteris. That's fine. That's not the same thing. You didn't worship the tree. You just used the shade of the tree to put avodah zara underneath it. So therefore, that has nothing to do with the tree. That's fine. Thank you. We're at 48A1. Should mention that. Yes, Jeff.
So these are Asherah trees. Was it a specific type of tree, like like maple, cedar, or was it just any kind of tree they wanted to designate as Asherah?
It's a fair question. Any tree could be designated as Asherah, as far as I know, but I'm sure they had some kind of. I don't think any place that I've seen. I'm going to look it up now, where it talks about what specific kind of tree they liked to worship. But yes, it would. It seems to be that the tree had fruit, as we're going to discuss, because the usage of the fruit may be part of the prohibition. So I don't think it's a non-fruit bearing tree. But okay, so in any event, the basic answer is I think it could be any tree, as long as you're planning for the sake of idolatry. It could be an Asherah tree, but I don't know. I would presume they had some sort of religious practice that they liked a certain type of tree or something.
Sounds good.
Not the bonsai. Says the Gemara. Amri debei Rabbi Yanai. So they said the Yeshiva Rabbi Yanai, v'hu shehivrich v'hirkif begufo shel Elon. So this, sorry, 1 second. So this deal with pruning the tree, right? That is not just pruning lightly, according to the Yeshiva Rabbi Yanai. This is where they're actually what's called there's a word for it. They take the tree and they take a branch like a vine and they curve it back under the soil and cover the branch in the soil. Then that part that's underneath the soil grows new roots. I think there's a word in English. The art scroll talk about the flattening or something like that. I cannot remember what it's called. And then the other is grafting. Grafting is when you take a tree that already has roots and you cut into the branch and you put a new branch of the other tree in and you tie it up until the 2 trees grow together, right? That's grafting. So these are 2. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. These new branches that come out are now prohibited, right? But if all you did that was these branches grew out by themselves, this was just a natural outgrowth, that would not be prohibited. That's what he says. Because he says that grafting and this other process of putting the tree branch under the ground are similar to replanting. And he holds that in order for the tree to actually become Avodah Zara, you have to make a significant move on this tree that is parallel to planting. Simply cutting a couple of branches off is not enough. That's what he holds. Okay, now the Gemara says, V'ha'anan tanan, but v'ha'anan gidu upislu tanan. But 1 second, our Mishnah doesn't say that. Our Mishnah just says pruning and trimming the tree, right? So therefore, any pruning or trimming should cause the prohibition according to Mishnah. Ella ki itmar Rabbi Yanai le'inyan bittul itmar. Rather, what Rabbi Yanai meant to say, it was not talking about the establishment of a tree into turning into Avodah Zara, because our Mishnah clearly says just pruning the branches is enough to be able to designate the new growth for Avodah Zara. Rabbi Yanai was talking about nullifying the tree that was worshipped for Avodah Zara. Da'af al gav dehivrich vehirkif begufo shel ilon ki noto mashe hichlif shapir dami. So what it means to say is that even though you took this tree and you replanted it, you curved it under the ground, or you grafted it, the old original tree remains permitted. Okay, the original tree that you grafted into, you took this and you pulled now this new tree that comes out is going to become prohibited, but the original tree remains permitted. That's what he meant to point out. That's what he meant to say. Now, what's the big deal of that statement? Ma'udetema, what would you have thought to say? You would have thought, Kevan dehivrich vehirkif begufo shel ilon, ki ilon shenatu mitchila dami. These are significant enough actions that it's almost like replanting the original tree. You're making such a difference on the tree, the tree, that it's almost like you replanted. And so therefore you might have thought that it has the same law as planting originally for the sake of Avodah Zara, and the original tree is also nullified. So therefore, let's say Kula, you're going to even nullify the whole original tree. Kamash Malon. So therefore the answer is no. The grafting or the tunneling, I want to say it's like tunneling, something like that, right? What is the word that it says, Jeff, in the art school there?
They call it layering.
Thank you. It's a word that has nothing. I looked it up in the art school to see what it was called. But layering, and that's basically the process. If you can imagine, you've got a branch that's on the tree out of the ground, and you take it, you run it back under the ground, put dirt on top of the branch, then that will cause it to regrow. That's what we're talking about. But that, we say, is nothing. There's nothing more significant about that process than the process of trimming or pruning. Right? It's not to say that the Mishnah intended to say only those are the things that cause the Avodah Zarah growth to grow. Trimming and pruning also do. But this also does not prohibit the original tree. And like the pruning does not prohibit the original tree. Okay, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, if somebody bows down to a tree, okay, and it was not originally planted for Avodah Zarah, so Tosafte Asura. So whatever grows after that point becomes prohibited. Okay, that's what Shmuel says. So the problem is Meisiv Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar asked the question: how do you understand our Mishnah? Our Mishnah says Gido upislo lavodas kochavim vehechlif notomash echlif. He says that you have to prune, if you prune and trim the tree, then whatever grows afterwards becomes prohibited. So that means Gido upislo in lo gidu pislu lo. That means that you have to trim or prune the tree in order to be able to establish its new growth as Avodah Zarah. Simply walking over to it and bowing down to it is not enough to designate it as Avodah Zarah. So Amar lecha Shmuel. So Shmuel will answer you. Hamani tzrabananhi. This is the Rabbanan's point of view. Remember, we had an argument between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi about whether trees can be, whether the original tree is prohibited. Okay. So this is the rabbis, right? And so therefore, this is our Mishnah. Our Mishnah follows the rabbis. In order to establish a tree as Avodah Zarah, according to the rabbis, you have to prune and trim it. Shmuel, Damar Rabbi Yossi, and Bar Yehuda. Shmuel is going according to Rabbi Yossi, Bar Yehuda, and who says all you have to do is bow down to it, and then the tree becomes prohibited. He is much more, I guess, restrictive, that less has to be done in order to designate this tree as Avodah Zarah. Damar, he says, Elon shenatu ulevasof avdo, Aser. He's the one, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, in a previous Mishnah had said, in a brayso that we've quoted, that a tree that was planted and in the end it was worshipped is prohibited. Doesn't say, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that there has to be any pruning or trimming done. So therefore, that's the argument. Our Mishnah says there has to be some pruning or trimming done. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says no pruning or trimming needs to be done. Okay. Maskif lo Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks a question on that. Mimait Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanon betosefes pligi. How do you know, just theoretically, we'll throw this out to confuse everybody, how do you know that the argument between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim is about whether the growth that grows afterwards becomes prohibited? Meaning they're both talking about, according to the way we just explained it, at some action takes place, and then everything that grows afterwards becomes prohibited. You have to cut that stuff off in order to make this tree permitted again. Or you can get a non-Jew. But this, if you have no non-Jews around, all you got to cut, trim, prune all this new stuff that comes out. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's just bowing down to it. According to the Chachamim, you have to prune or trim it. How do you know that's their argument? Dilma tosefes l'divrei kol aser. Maybe everyone agrees that all of the new growth is always prohibited. Ubi-ikaro pligi. And the argument between them is the original tree itself. To Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Savar, as Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda is saying that ikaro nami aser. If you prune and trim the tree, the original tree becomes prohibited as well. And Dechsiv, how do you know that? Because he says, the pasuk says, "Vasherehem tisrafun ba'esh." You have to burn their Asherah tree. The original Asherah becomes prohibited. The tree becomes prohibited, even though it wasn't planted for the sake of Avodah Zara. Afterwards, you bow down to it, or then afterwards you start pruning and trimming the tree becomes prohibited. The original tree has to be cut down. The new growth, bowing down to it, is enough. The Rabbanan Savri and the Rabbanan disagree. They hold Ikar Elon Shari. The original tree remains intact. If you prune and trim that tree, the original tree is still fine. It's only the new stuff that grows afterwards that becomes prohibited. Ditsiv, as the pasuk says, "Vasherehem tigadeun." You have to prune and cut off the tree. Right? It doesn't say you have to burn it. Right? That circumstance, all you have to do is prune and trim it. So ezehu elon she gidu o aser v'ikaro shari. How do you have a tree that just pruning and trimming is going to solve the problem, where the new growths are going to be prohibited, but the original tree is permissible? Haviyomer Elon Shenatu Ulvasof Avdu. We're talking about a tree that was planted and in the end it was worshipped. Now, if you're going to go back in time and you're going to go back to the Gemara that we had a few days ago, that is not how we interpreted the argument between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan. So, right? The Gemara we had on Mem Hamid Beis says that the issue is, they did not explain that the issue was the original tree, right? They explained Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda back then that he says that if you started to worship it, then he says that he says then you have to remove the branches, the limbs themselves become prohibited, whereas the Chachamim said even those limbs don't be prohibited if you bow down to it. It's like we just said. They're going to require you to prune or trim the tree in order to make those limbs prohibited. That's how we interpreted before. So Rav Ashi is going to say, Epoch. So we can go back to the argument, the way that things went back and forth in the psukim before. The way that we had learned it before is, we just said, Rabbi Yossi says, that Asherehem tisrefun v'asherim tisrefun ba'esh, you have to burn their trees. The issue is that we actually interpreted it as, we used the psukim when we talked about this back on Daf Mem Hey, and we'll go through this quick because this will make your head spin. If you go through Daf Mem Hey again, which was a little bit of a complicated piece, we had Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda who suggested that if you bow down to a tree that was not originally planted for Avodah Zara, you have to trim that tree and remove those branches. And what was his source? From the pasuk of Tigadeun, that you should cut the branches off. And so therefore he applies that pasuk to this tree that was worshipped, but not originally planted for that. Well, now you're saying that he's not the one who uses that pasuk for that. The Rabbanan are using the pasuk, and he's the one who says that you should burn the tree. So Rav Ashi's answer is, okay, flip it around. We're going to make it that Rav Ashi says you should burn the tree, and the Chachamim say that you only have to do is clip off the future branches. And then we said, but wait a second, remember that the Chachamim had said that they used the Asherim Tigadiyun, that you have to cut off the branches. And we said, why did they use that? And they told us a whole drasha about how when you came into Eretz Yisrael, you cut the branches first, then you go after everybody, then you come back and destroy everything again at the end, right? That was how the Chachamim, okay, now we're going to make that Rabbi Yossi's opinion. We're going to switch it around. We're going to flip everything around in that, okay? So therefore, Epoch Rabbanan l'Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda l'Rabbanan. All of that back and forth where they were asking, the Chachamim had this opinion, and you were trying to ask, what does Rabbi Yossi do? You got to flip everybody now, right? The whole psukim, you got to go back to Daf Mem Hey and flip over everybody. Okay, so now, Im Kain. So if you do that, though, Ravashi, and you're going to insist that your argument is really about whether you have to burn the original tree according to Rabbi Yossi ben Bar Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda, Bar Yehuda, im kain gid'u pislo man katanile. So, okay, well, now who's the opinion that's talking about the trees that are pruned or trimmed in our Mishnah? We only have two choices. We have the Rabbanan and we have Yossi bar Yehuda. It's lo Rabbanan. It can't be the Rabbanan, velo Rabbi Yossi. And it can't be Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Because why? Because Rabbanan, if our Mishnah was following the Rabbanan's view, below Gidu Upislo, nami Tosefas Asura. Now you're telling me that even the Rabbanan would say that if you bow down to the tree, the additional growth would be prohibited. Because that's, you're saying, they're only arguing about whether the original tree is prohibited. Well, that means if they bow down to it, the original tree is not prohibited, but the new growth is prohibited. That's the Rabbanan's position. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, and if you hold of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, so then if you start making trimmings and prunings, Ikar Ilan Namios, or the whole original tree becomes prohibited as well. Everything becomes prohibited, and now the original tree has to be burnt up as well. So therefore, how do you explain our Mishnah? What's our Mishnah talking about? So the answer is Ibois Emer Rabbanan v'Ibois Emer Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. I'll try to give you two potential explanations of our Mishnah, that it could go according to Rabbanan and it can go according to Rabbi Yehuda. Ibois Emer Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. I'll tell you first. We'll start with Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda's opinion. V'chikama Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda below gido pislu ikar ilan aser bistama. Right? He says that even if you don't cut off the branches, right, trim or prune, he says the original trunk is now to be burned. That's what Ravashi is trying to suggest. The tree is to be burned. The new stuff is to be burned. That's how Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says. So what do you mean? What does our Mishnah mean when it says talking about pruning or trimming? Avagido pislo gali adate de betosefes nichole beikar ilan lo nichole. It actually goes the reverse. If he prunes and trims the tree, then the person who's doing the Avodah Zara makes it clear that he doesn't want to worship the original tree. He only wants to worship the new stuff that he just pruned off of. Therefore, if he prunes and trims the tree, that actually saves the original tree from being burned. And then that's the circumstance where the new growth now needs to be destroyed. That could be how Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda is learning our Mishnah. The original tree, if you just walk over to a tree and bow down to it, the tree is prohibited. You have to burn the tree. However, our Mishnah says if you prune and trim the tree, then all of the new branches only are prohibited. That's how Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda learns our Mishnah. Rabbanan, or if you want, I'll go according to the Rabbanan. Gido upislo itzrichale. Salkadaitach amina, he says that you need to prune and trim the bushes in order to prune and trim this tree in order to prohibit the new growth, right? Otherwise, just bowing down to it, even according to the Rabbanan, would not be enough to prohibit the original growth, because Salkadaitach amina, I would have thought to have said, Kaven to avad lamaisa begufei ikar ilanami litzar. That you're right, bowing down to it would also prohibit the tree. But remember same thing that we did by the rock. We said that we might have thought that carving into the rock would prohibit the whole rock. Well, pruning the tree is already something you're doing to the original tree. Maybe the whole tree becomes prohibited. So therefore the Chachamim are saying, Kamash Malan, that no, only if you bow down to it, you don't even need to prune or trim the tree. And even if you prune or trim the tree, only the new stuff. We never prohibit the original tree from getting ruined. So therefore, that's how the Rabbanan will learn this Mishnah. So this is a Rav Ashi's perspective on how to potentially understand the argument between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, which is different than we explained it a couple of days ago, and it's a whole different perspective on our Mishnah as well. Okay, so that's fine. Let's move on to the next Mishnah. Ezu Asherah, what is an Asherah? It's essentially Jeff's question, but it doesn't answer it like he would want, like it's a pear tree. No, it's just what makes an Asherah? Kol sheyesh tachtav volos kochav, any tree that there's idolatry underneath it. Okay, that's what we say. Reb Shimon Omer kol she'ovdin osa, you have to worship the tree. Umaisa betzidon, and there's a story what happened betzidon be'ilon shahayu ovdin oso. There was a story in Tzidon where there was a tree that they were worshiping it. Umatsu tachtav gal, and they found underneath this tree a pile of stones. Okay. Amar lehet Reb Shimon said to him, Badku es hagal hazeh, you got to search this pile of stones. Clearly, if they're worshiping this tree, this pile of stones has religious significance. And we may have Avodah Zara here that we have to take care of. So ubadkuhu, so they searched the pile of stones. Umatsu bot tsura, and they found a image engraved in the rocks. So therefore, it was indeed Avodah Zara. Amar lahen, hoel ulatsura hein ovdin, natir lahen es ha'ilon. So Rabbi Shimon said, since the rocks are clearly the worship that was going on here, the tree itself is permissible. Because we said that it's not that there's Avodah Zarah under the tree that makes it an Asherah, right? We said that it has to be that the tree itself is worshipped. If the tree itself is, but if you found Avodah Zarah underneath the tree when they were worshiping, it's clear that's what they were here worshiping all along. The tree is fine. That's what they want to say. Okay. And of course, then you wouldn't have to cut it down and destroy it. Saves you a tree. Says the Gemara, Ezu Asherah. So what's an Asherah? V'hanan, but we already said Sholosh Asherahs Tanan. We already just had last Mishnah. Last Mishnah told us there were three types of Asherah situations. So Hachi Kamar. This is what we mean to say. Shtayim L'divrei Akol. There are two of these types of trees that everybody agrees to are Asheros. V'achas machlokas Reb Shimon v'Rabbanan. And one argument that exists between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan. What's our Mishnah saying? What is the type of tree circumstance, the Asherah tree circumstance that Reb Shimon and the Chachamim argue about? If you find underneath it idolatry, so then that is an argument whether that's also a type of idolatry or not. Rabbi Shimon Omar Kol She'ovdim Osan. Rabbi Shimon says no, idolatry underneath it doesn't make it an Asherah. The tree itself has to be worshipped in order to make it an Asherah. Okay, good. Ezohi Asherah. So then we say what makes something an Asherah? Ezo Asherah Stam, right? What is the how are you supposed to take a look at a tree and determine whether it's an Asherah or not? Amar Rav says, Kol shekomrim yoshim tafteha. If you've got a whole bunch of priests underneath that tree, that's a good sign that that's probably an Asherah, right? Wherever you find a bunch of priests, they're probably worshiping something. Ve'ena toamin mi peiroseha, right? So therefore, they're not eating the fruit. Meaning, if they're having a party underneath this coconut tree and they're all eating coconuts, that's a good place to have a coconut party underneath a coconut tree, right? However, if there's a bunch of, they're all sitting under this tree, there are fruits in the tree, they're not eating the fruits, then it's probably an Asherah tree. Shmuel says, Afilo amri hani tamri lebe nitzrefe aser, right? Shmuel says, he says, even if they say these dates that are, we're going to give these dates to this Avodah Zarah called Bei Natzrefei, the tree is prohibited. Why? Derami Bei Shichra. Because what they're going to do is they're going to take these dates and they're going to make date beer out of it. Vishasile. And then they're going to drink it. Biyom Edom on their holiday. And that clearly indicates that this is a tree of religious significance because the beer is holy beer, right? The beer that comes from this tree becomes special holy beer. Okay. So Amar Meimar, Amru Lisabi. So Meimar said that the Kanim, the elders of De Pumpadisa said, Hilchasa Kishmuel, the halacha is like Shmuel, right? The halacha is like Shmuel. That right, as long as that they're sitting there and they're not eating the fruit, it's an Avodah Zarah. Okay, Memchas Amad Beis. Lo yeshev b'tzila. You're not supposed to sit under the shade of an Asherah tree. V'im yashav tar, but if you do, you don't become impure. Remember we said that Avodah Zarah causes impurity. If you sit underneath the shade, you are tahor. We'll see why. V'lo ya'avor tachtel. You're not allowed to pass underneath it. V'im avar tameh. If you do pass underneath the tree, you are tameh. Haisa gozelas es harabim v'avar tachteha tar. If the tree is reaching out into the public area, it steals from the public area, and you travel underneath it, then you're tahor, then you're pure. Now let's talk about that. Lo yeshev b'tzila. You're not supposed to sit in the shade. Pshita, of course not. You're not allowed to get benefit from Avodah Zarah. Of course you can't sit in the shade. Amar Rabbi Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Barchana says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo mitzvah el litzel tzila. We're talking about the shade of the shade. This is a concept that Rashi describes. Shade of the shade is in the early morning and the evening. The shadow of the tree is longer than the tree itself. That being the case, the shadow that extends beyond the height or length of the tree, you're not going underneath the tree. That's why you're not tummy. You're going where the shadow, the lengthy shadow, casts. And this lengthy shadow is a much lighter shadow. It's not as strong as when the sun is like directing all of the shadow down. And so therefore, that is the type of a shadow that this Mishnah is telling us that you're not tummy if you're getting benefit, if you sit underneath it, that is not a problem. Miklal debetzel komasa im yeshev tame. So does that mean that if you were sitting underneath the shade of the actual height of the tree, meaning if the sun goes up high enough and the tree, the length of the shadow and the tree are the same height, so now if you sit in that, if you sit in that shadow, you are tameh? No, that's not true. That can't be. You're not underneath the tree either. Even if you sit in the shade of the tree itself, you're also tar. This is coming to teach us that even though this is the shadow of the shadow, it's the extended shadow of the tree, you're still not supposed to sit there. And therefore, even though you're not tameh because you sit underneath the tree, right? Because the tuma only travels if you're underneath the same roof as the tuma. So even though you're not tameh, this Mishnah is just trying to extend the idea that the shadow is still significant enough you can't get benefit from it. So don't sit there. Ika demasni law aseifa. Some taught this teaching on the next part of the Mishnah. Vim yoshav tahor. If you sit underneath it, you are tahor. Right, that part. So pshita, that's obvious. If you sit in a shadow, why would you be impure? You're not underneath the tree. Amar Rabbi Barchan says Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Yochanan. Lo nitzrcha el etzel komasa. This is telling us that if you sit in the tree, which is the height of the tree, you're still not tameh, even though you're sitting in the direct shadow of the tree. So what does that mean? That you're supposed to derive from this that if you sit in the extended shadow of the tree, that you are allowed? No, don't figure that. Ha kamash milan. This is just coming to teach us that im yoshev tahor. It's just coming to tell us that the shadow, if you sit underneath the main shadow, you are still tahor. You're still not impure, right? The law of the shadow and the shadow itself is the same. Don't sit there, but there's no impurity that comes. But you might have thought that the shadow would be stricter than the shadow of the shadow. That's why our Mishnah is coming to make that clear. Okay, next is don't walk underneath it. V'lo yavor tachtav. Don't go underneath a shera tree. V'im avar tameh, and if you go there, then you're tameh. My taima. So what is the reason? Because they must have done sacrifices underneath this ashera tree. And the tree itself becomes a roof overhead. So anything that's underneath is in the same room, the same underneath area of where there's tuma. So who is this opinion? This is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. This is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's opinion. The Tanya's, we learned in a brisa, we've had this before. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Omer Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, how do I know that if a sacrifice for idolatry is in the same room, that everything underneath that roof becomes tameh? Shenemar, as the pasuk says, I'm always going to say this word wrong. Vayitzamdu lebal por. I always say it wrong. Vayitzamdu lebal por vayochlu zivche mesim. Right? They became attached to Baal Por, and they ate from the sacrifices of the dead. Why they call this Avodah Zara the sacrifices of the dead? It's a comparison. Ma makes mitame be'ohel, just like a dead person makes everything in the same room as it tameh. So to all sacrifices, to idolatry, also make everything under the same roof tameh. So therefore, don't go underneath the tree. Then it says, Haisa gozelas es harabim. The Mishnah then said, if it goes into the public area, then, okay, v'avar tachtav. Now you go under it, you're tar, right? We've seen graveyards, and you've got trees that extend into the public thoroughfare. Well, if it was an Avodah Zara and it went into the public thoroughfare, it would be tar. So iboilus, we asked the following question. Avar o over. How do you read this Mishnah? Is it that if you happen to pass by, right? You're not supposed to pass by, but if you happen to pass by, b'diavad, then it's okay, you're not tameh. Or does it mean over? You have to go through. You don't have to worry about finding another way around. Don't worry about if it's in the public area, not your problem. Go right through. So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar mishmei de Chizkiah Amar. So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar then said the name of Chizkiah. Over, it means you can go right through it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar im over. Rabbi Yochanan says b'diavad. Don't go, ideally, but if you went, then you're not tameh. Velo pligi, but the two of them are not arguing with each other. Sounds like they're arguing, but they're not. They're just talking about two different circumstances. It depends if there's another road you can take. If there's another road you can take, better take that one. But if there's no other way to go, then go ahead and go through. Don't worry about it. Amar Rav Sheshes Lisham A. So Rav Sheshes said to his servant, Kimatis lahasam arhitni. He says, when we get to that location where there's a tree that's worth going over the Avodah Zara, let's run past. Right? I don't want to stay underneath this tree with the Avodah Zara. Let's run through. So hey dami. So what was the circumstance in that case? Why did he ask his servant? He says, let's run. If there was no other way to go, lama li arhitni. Why does he have to run? He's allowed. Right? Mishra, shari, he's permissible. And if there's another way through, mishari, why is he allowed to run through? He shouldn't go that way at all. He should go around. So the answer is there was no other way around. But an important person like Rav Sheshes has to be extra careful that people are going to see him and they're going to think that he's under the Asherah tree and make bad presumptions. So he went above the letter of the law and said, let's run through this and not get above. New Mishnah. Zorin tachtel yerakos biyamosa geshamim. You're allowed during the winter time to plant vegetables underneath it. Why? Because shade is not necessary in the wintertime. So therefore, there's no benefit to these vegetables that they're underneath the Asherah tree getting shade from the sun because it's the wintertime. However, aval lo b'mosachama, you can't do it in the summertime. In the summertime, the vegetables will dry out if they are in the sun too directly. So therefore, if you're creating indirect sunlight by planting under the tree, you're getting benefit from the Asherah tree. That's prohibited. You can't do that. Vehechziron lo b'mos hachama velo b'mos hagishamin. Chazirin. This is lettuce. Right? Chazeres, like we have on Pesach, right? So if you have lettuce, not during the winter or the summer, lettuce always gets wilty in the sun, as we know, right? So keep your lettuce out of the sun. Rabbi Yossi says, Aflo Yerakos b'mosag geshamim. You're not allowed to put your vegetables even in the wintertime under the tree. Why? Because the trees fall in the fall, and then you get mulch. And that's good for the soil. And so therefore the tree is actually sustaining and making very nice soil for the vegetables. Don't go under the tree, even for that reason. Okay, so says the Gemara. This is Rabbi Yossi saying that I've got two causes. What makes vegetables grow? A combination of the soil and the fertilization and the fertilizer. So therefore, the soil is perfectly permissible. We said the mountain, the soil, can't become Avodah Zara. But the leaves that fall, so that is mulch, and that's from Avodah Zara. That should be prohibited. V'Rabbanan Amri zevezegorim is mutter, and therefore, and he says it's prohibited because I've got parts of the tree. Now the Rabbanan are arguing with him, and they say, who cares about the leaves that fall? Not important. The leaves that fall are not important. As long as you have some element of permissibility here, that overrides it. And this item, since it's both, these vegetables are coming about both from the prohibited leaves and the permissible soil, the vegetables are fine. Okay. But we know that Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim hold the exact opposite. And that is Ditnan, we learn in a Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yossi says, Sochek v'zora l'ruach. When we talked about the metal idols and we had to grind them up and we had to destroy them, we had a problem. We were going to throw them into the water and we were worried that as a result that it may fertilize the ground wherever it lands. So who was the one who worried about the fertilizer there? So he says you could throw it, you could grind it up. Rabbi Yossi says you can grind it up and throw it into the wind, omatil liyam, or throw it into the sea. So that means Rabbi Yossi is saying you don't have to worry about the fertilizer. Even though it was Avodah Zara, it's not a problem. So why is Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah talking about you worry about the leaves as fertilizer, and then when he talks about grinding up the Avodah Zara, he doesn't worry about it being fertilizer? Which way does it go? Amru lo, and then the Chacham said to him, Af hi nasa zevel, you can't do that because then you'll fertilize the ground. Well, now the Chachamim all of a sudden are worrying about fertilizing the ground. How come the Rabbanan in our Mishnah are not worrying about fertilizing the ground? You have Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan holding alternate, opposite perspectives in two different places. V'nemar lo yibak biyadcha me'umah. As the Chachamim say, you can't get any benefit out of the idolatry. So therefore, having any amount of fertilization of the soil is going to be problematic. Right? Sorry, I skipped the last words. So kasha the Rabbanan, kasha Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi. The Chachamim are contradicting themselves, and Rabbi Yossi is contradicting himself. So Bishlam and Rabbi Yossi, the Rabbi Yossi lo kasha. So fine, Rabbi Yossi is not a problem because hasam de ka'azil li'ibud matir. He says the reason why is the idol that got ground up, the grinding up of the idol is destruction. Therefore, at this point, when you spread it out and it happens to fertilize, that's not a prohibited item because it was destroyed. It was nullified. That's your process of destroying it. Whatever happens after that, after it's been destroyed and dispersed and it happens to fertilize soil, then he doesn't care about that, right? However, in our case, the tree is still there. It's the Avodah Zara. The leaves that come down are from the Avodah Zara. Now he's worried about it. Hacha, deloka azali ibud. The tree is not being destroyed. Aser. So therefore, the leaves that come down and provide mulch and sustenance for the soil, now he's going to say those vegetables are prohibited. So that's the difference in Rabbi Yossi. Okay, that makes some sense. The Rabbanan kasha, but the rabbis they don't make sense. They're more worried about fertilizing the soil with the ground up idol than they are with the leaves from the Asherah tree. They're not worried about that. So epuch. Okay, well we're forced. We've got to flip it. We're going to exchange the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi's Shita in one of the two Mishnayos, right? You got to flip it. Although that way they're consistent. V'boy Zema, or okay, come up with a better answer. If not, we don't like to flip and change the Shitos because that means we're changing texts. We don't like to do that. So let's not do that. To Rabbi Yossi Kiddushanina. So the answer is Rabbi Yossi, we already explained, right? We already explained how Rabbi Yossi is not a problem. The Rabbanan, but according to the Rabbanan, Kida Omar Rav Mori Braid Rav Kahana. It's like Rav Mori says in the name of Rav Mori, the son of Rav Kahana, said, Mashe Mashbiach Be'or Pogem Bebasar. There's a issue that is unrelated to our Gemara. There was a question in the Beis Hamikdash. If you have an animal that develops a blemish, so now it's going to be sold on the market, and the profit goes to the Beis Hamikdash. So you want to be able to get the maximum profit for it, okay? So, but you can't treat it disrespectfully either. So there are two ways to skin, right? There's more than one way to skin a cat. Well, apparently there's more than one way to skin a cow as well, or a bull, whatever it is. So now you can skin it by cutting open the chest cavity and pulling the skin apart, apparently. And if you do so, then that gets you to the meat. And that was generally the way that it is done if you're butchering in order to get the meat. However, apparently there was a way to skin the animal from the back legs, holding it going the other direction, from the bottom of the animal upwards, right? If you go in that direction, somehow, I'm not exactly sure why, the hide comes out more whole and is intact, and as a result of that, it's more valuable. So therefore, the problem with doing that is that the meat becomes damaged in the process, and we don't want to damage this meat that used to be sacrificial level meat. Now it's not; it got a blemish on it, but we need to treat it properly. So to damage the meat and degrade the meat, we don't want to do. So therefore, they said, well, but it should be okay to do it. Why? Because you're elevating the profit. You're elevating the profit that the Beis Hamikdash is going to make by allowing the meat to be degraded slightly. Because the hide is going to now become worth more money. That's where Rav Mori, the son of Rav Kahana, said, whatever profit you're going to get by having the hide more intact, you're going to lose corresponding profit by the meat being less valuable because of the way that the meat gets handled during the removing of the skin in this process. Therefore, it's not worth it. This statement of Rav Mori, the son of Kahana, is used in all contexts when there's a phrase, I think there's an English phrase. I can't think of the phrase where basically what you lose as much as you gain, right? You're not benefiting here ultimately. So therefore, this is what the Chachamim are saying about these leaves. Ultimately, under this tree, the shade damages the vegetables as much as the leaves benefit the vegetables. So therefore, the question is, are these vegetables benefiting from Avodah Zara? The Chachamim say, no, they're really not, right? Ultimately, the vegetables are losing as much by being under this tree as they would gain by being under this tree. So therefore, that's why they hold that being under the tree is permissible. So Hanami, that's what's going on here. Mashpiach benivya pogim bitzel. Whatever benefit they're getting by the leaves being mulched and being nice soil underneath, you're losing in the shade. So therefore, that's why they don't worry about the fertilization. This Asherah is not doing any good for these vegetables. That's why they say it's permissible. V'savar Rabbi Yossi. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, does Rabbi Yossi hold zev v'zeh gorim aser? This whole argument is all predicated on the presumption that what's going on here is Rabbi Yossi doesn't like the fact that the mulch, these leaves that come down onto the soil are going to have some element in helping these vegetables grow. They're helping, but they're not really doing all of everything because the soil, which is permissible, is also making the vegetables grow. So you have a zev v'zeh gorim. Both the soil and the leaves are helping these vegetables grow. Rabbi Yossi says that's prohibited. But is that consistent with Rabbi Yossi's opinion in many other Gemaras? Rabbi Yossi says, Notin yichor shel urla, vein notin egos shel urla. You're allowed to plant a branch, a sapling from an urla tree. If you have a tree that grows, a new tree, during its first 3 seasons of fruit, you cannot get any benefit from the fruit. That's called urla. Now, if you take a branch from that tree and you plant it, you're prohibited. The prohibition applies to getting benefit from any fruit from that tree. The branch is not a fruit. So if you cut off from the branch and you plant it in the ground, and now you've got a new tree that grows from that, that's benefit that's permissible because you didn't benefit from the fruit. However, if you take the nut of this tree and you plant that, the nut is the fruit. Now you're getting benefit from the fruit. That's where you're going to violate your prohibition against benefiting from orla. Because that's the fruit. V'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. So now V'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rav. Mode Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi would agree. Shimnota v'hivrich v'hirkiv mutter. That if you planted and you grafted into the tree, so then that will be permissible. You take this, you plant. So what happened is you planted a nut from an orla tree, which is now the sapling that grows is prohibited. But what he does is he cuts open and he takes a branch, which is permitted, and he puts that into this tree, and now he grows from that. Now, don't do that. But if you do that, the tree, whatever comes out from that is now permissible. Why? Because we have a case of zev v'zeh gorim, right? We have the prohibited roots and the permitted branch mixed together. And one second, in our Mishnah now we're saying Rabbi Yossi says the zev v'zeh gorim is prohibited. If I have 2 causes and I put them together, it's prohibited. But now Rabbi Yossi is saying 2 causes, you put them together, and it's permitted. So now we have a problem. We're trying to figure out which of those 2 ways Rabbi Yossi holds. We need him to be consistent. V'tanya nami hach. We have another brisa that says also like this. Mode Rabbi Yossi would agree. Shimnata v'hivrich v'hirkaf mutter. If you planted the nut and then you grafted a permissible branch into that rooted section, that would be permissible to use. So, v'chi tema shani leil Rabbi Yossi ben shari surim lavodos kochavim. And before you say that Rabbi Yossi has a consistent viewpoint, zev v'zeh gorim is always permissible, right? If I have 2 causes, it's permissible. But he's stricter when it comes to Avodah Zara. The Asherah tree is different because it's Avodah Zara. So he wants to be stricter. So normally he says zev v'zeh gorim is permissible. But when it comes to the Asherah tree, that's where he's going to say prohibited. Umishanile, but he doesn't make that distinction. V'hatanya, we learn in the Brisa. Sodeshin is davla bezevel avodos kochavim. If you have a field and he fertilized the field with manure from an idolatrous source, right? A cow that was idolatrous. V'chein para shenispatma bekarshini avodos kochavim. So too, if you have a cow and they fed it fodder that came from Avodah Zara. So you're benefiting, your field is better because of the Avodah Zara, or your cow is fatter because of the Avodah Zara. So Tani Chada, we have two different views here. One, Brisa says, Soda Tizra Paratishachet. Go ahead and plant your field, no problem, don't worry about it. And one says, slaughter the cow, no problem. V'tanya Idach, then we have another Brisa that says exactly the opposite. Soda Tabur, you have to leave the field fallow, don't get any benefit from this fertilization. Upara Tiraza, and you've got to let the cow get skinny, get lean, because you don't want to get any benefit from fattening up the cow using this Avodah Zara fodder. So, my love, aren't we dealing with here Rabbi Yossi v'Harabanan? That one is Rabbi Yossi's opinion that says it's permissible, and the other is the Rabbanan's position that say it's prohibited. And so, therefore, this is a case of Avodah Zara, and yet Rabbi Yossi says it's permissible. So, Blow, don't answer that. Ha Rabbi Elazar v'Harabanan. This is not those two Brises is not an argument between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. It's an argument between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbanan. So we're going to now discuss where it is that Rabbi Elazar, we're going to stop here, pause here in the middle, right? That Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan are arguing about Zev Goreim. And so therefore, this issue about Zev Goreim is really Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, which means that we're going to be stuck with Rabbi Yossi being contradictory about Zev Goreim, and we're going to try to resolve that by saying that Rabbi Yossi is stricter when it comes to Avodah Zara. That's where we're headed. So this is a great place to stop. So we'll stop the recording. And
fantastic.
Then,